the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to this the Yaron Brook Show on this Monday, Memorial Day. You know, I hope you had a good weekend. We are going to talk about Memorial Day today, what it means, what it represents, and the connection of Memorial Day, or more broadly, talk about patriotism. So, yeah, Skylar says Happy Memorial Day. I guess it's kind of strange for me to think of a happy Memorial Day, or Memorial Day should be a day of remembrance, of contemplation, of definitely of some sadness and appreciation and recognition for the people who fought for this country and who ended up dying for this country, or for the freedom in this country, and that we benefit from, from their willingness to fight and in some cases their death made possible our life. So it's a somber day. It's a day really of recognition and appreciation. And recognition and appreciation. I don't like to call it sacrifice, because I hope that most of them did not sacrifice, although I suspect some of them did. But of their passion, of their value, of the fact that they were willing to fight for what this country, in particular, this United States of America, actually represents. So, I come from a country. I was born and raised, many of you know this, in Israel. And in Israel, we have a Memorial Day every year. And a Memorial Day every year is a day where everything is shut down. Everybody pretty much stays home. It's a day of sadness. It's a day of commemoration. It's a day of going to cemeteries. It's a day of a lot of kind of national, if you will, commemoration and ceremonies to respect and commemorate the fallen soldiers. Now, of course, Israel. This is very real in Israel. It's a small country. It's about 8 million people. Almost everybody knows people who have died in a war or in a military action. Everybody is connected to that. Almost everybody has been in a war and has had friends or family die in one, but has actually, most Israelis have served in a war, at least in military action. Although the last war Israel was engaged in, or last real war Israel was engaged in, was in Lebanon in 1982, which is the war I was in, and that's a long time ago already. That's a long time ago. That's almost 40 years. And while Israel has had other conflicts over the 40 years, primarily in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon again, they haven't been full-scale wars to the extent that the previous wars were. But still, it is, it is very, in Israel, it's very real. And I think America, because of its size, because of the fact that the United States has a voluntary army, so that very few families actually have members in the military. So even though right now, for example, as we speak, the American servicemen in, 100 countries, the American troops, primarily, significant numbers of them in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syria, in various parts of Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia. The American troops are all over the world. And yet, it touches very few people. That recognition that there are people who are fighting for this country, that recognition, there's very little recognition among the American population of that fact. And it's also the fact that almost nobody in America understands why we have troops in 100+ countries around the world. Right? Almost no American wars have been wars, with the exception of the War of Independence, the Civil War, and to some extent World War II. No American wars have been wars of survival. Wars of survival. So, very few American wars have actually been existential threats. Again, I compare to Israel because that's the country I know. Every war is an existential threat for Israel. Certainly, the wars, the big wars in '67 and '73, were big wars of in the War of Independence in Israel, were existential wars. And even the smaller wars, if you will, and Boaz tells me I forgot the 2006 Lebanon War. I mean, it's hard to call it a full-fledged war in 2006. I guess you could call it a war, but I just don't. It was so limited. It was so constrained, both in terms of the action, the goals, the purpose, of both sides, that it's hard to call it a war. But okay, it doesn't really matter. The civilian population of Israel is always under threat during these wars. Whereas in the United States, civilian population, other than last time the civilian population was really a threat, was Pearl Harbor. And before that, it was the Civil War. The American population, because of the fact that America is on a separate continent where most of the wars are being fought, it's far away. America is a vast, large country. The American civilian population doesn't feel the war, doesn't experience war. And I think, therefore, there's a certain distance. So even though, for example, right now, as I said, we have troops all over the place, American soldiers are still dying, particularly in Afghanistan, to some extent in Iraq, and recently in Africa. Even though troops are dying, the numbers are small. Very few of us know them. And it's kind of distant. It's remote. And none of us really understand what we're doing there. To what extent are the troops in Afghanistan actually pretending my freedom? To what extent are the troops in Africa actually defending my freedom? Now, you can make an argument they are. I'm not saying they're not. But it's not real to Americans. And as a consequence, I think Memorial Day is, in many ways, not a real commemorative event. It's more another excuse for a long weekend. I think veterans' families maybe are more connected to it and see it more as a memory, and certainly families who have lost a loved one in combat, particularly over the last 12 years in the Middle East, use it as a time to commemorate the fallen. But it should be a time for commemoration. It should be a time for reflection. It should be a time for consideration of the purpose of our military, how it's being used, and maybe a certain appreciation of American history and the extent to which war has been part of that history, or an essential part of the creation of this country and the solidification of this country, certainly in its early wars. And I think most of that is lost on people, and it's not really, they don't take advantage of this day to really contemplate that. And of course, the connection between soldiers dying to defend this country and patriotism, soldiers dying to defend this country and sacrifice, and whether it is a sacrifice, and to whom it is a sacrifice, and what are soldiers today actually fighting to preserve, and to what extent are they aware of what they're fighting to preserve. I think those are all interesting questions that maybe we can get into this evening, talking about all of this. So I think Memorial Day was first established as a day to commemorate American troops who died during the Civil War. And of course, the Civil War is by far the bloodiest war that America's ever experienced. I think both in sheer numbers and in terms of a percentage of the population. I think its percentage of population, by far, it is the bloodiest conflict that America has participated in. Over 600,000 soldiers died during the war, both from the South but from the North. I think the North's casualties were larger. It is the war in the end that shaped much of American history. Certainly much of post-Civil War history is shaped by the consequence of that war and the dynamics of that war. It is a war that eradicated slavery, eradicated the one significant blemish on the founding of this country, the founding of the most moral country in human history, the country that is most, I think the most important country really of modern history, certainly, and arguably the most important country in all of history, because that it was founded on this principle, on this moral principle of individual rights, of liberty, of freedom, of the sanctity of the individual. And it is those principles that one could certainly argue that those who died in the War of Independence died for. It was most explicit then. It was clear what the war was about, why they were fighting it. Certainly there were other wars in the 19th century that were maybe a little bit more ambiguous, but some that probably needed to be fought, others maybe not, but were more ambiguous. But the Civil War was a war that I think without question had to be fought. It was a war that completed the American Revolution. It was a war that the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution set up as an inevitability because of the big compromise with Southern states, allowing them to preserve the institution of slavery. It was inevitable that at some point the contradiction between slavery and the Declaration would become evident, and a war like that would have to be fought. But if you think about it, from the Civil War until World War II, were any of the wars fought between those two wars necessary? Was there reason to fight a war with Spain in the 1890s? Was there reason for the United States to occupy the Philippines and to fight a war in the Philippines? Over what? And then, of course, maybe the greatest travesty in all of the military history of the United States, or political history in the United States, was there reason that over 100,000 Americans had to die during World War I? Was there reason the United States had to enter World War I? Was there any value, indeed, in entering World War I? So unfortunately, many American soldiers did not die to preserve the freedom of America, did not die to preserve our liberty, did not die to preserve this unique experiment that is America, but died because of the hubris and the arrogance and the grand ambitions of great politicians. Those politicians might have been, Teddy Roosevelt and I forget the name of the president during the American-Spanish War of the late 19th century, or whether it was the megalomania of a Herbert Hoover in the 19 teens when America joined to fight World War I and sent over 100,000 young men to their deaths in the trenches of Europe, actually swinging the war in the favor of President Wilson. Yeah, did I say somebody else? President Wilson in the 19-teens. I think the United States entered World War I in 1917. I think that's right. That was Wilson, sorry. And, over 100,000 men died. I think World War II was probably a necessary war. There was no option. The war started in 1914, but when did the United States enter the war? I didn't look up my history. I think the United States did not enter at the beginning. It came in towards the end. So I think it entered in 1917. So Woodrow Wilson, who ranks in my book as one of the worst presidents in American history, partially or to a large extent because of World War I, but also because of income tax, Federal Reserve, and just the progressive agenda that he had and brought into the White House that had devastating consequences for the future of America. Not that anything, other than World War I, the things that he particularly did during his presidency were some of the worst of any president, but the trend that he set in his presidency that changed American history, changed the trajectory of America. So many American troops over the years have died for wars they should have never fought, for wars that were not necessary, for the survival of the United States of America, were not necessary for the preservation of the individual rights of American citizens, and were necessary for the preservation of this unique experience of American exceptionalism, of American freedom and liberty. It's sad. And in that case, those soldiers were indeed a sacrifice. A sacrifice to what? A sacrifice, again, to the ambition of politicians. Not a sacrifice, not in a sense, a choice. Not a fight for values. But fodder for President Wilson. Fodder for, I forget the name of the president, it's on the tip of my tongue, who was president during the Spanish-American War. Somebody is going to help me out on the chat. That will happen. And of course, World War II is probably necessary, but then again, think of the tens of thousands of Americans who died in Vietnam for a senseless war that, again, was not about protecting America, wasn't about defending our values, wasn't about defending liberty or freedom, wasn't about protecting their own families. Died in Vietnam for what? Died in Vietnam for whom? Yes, it was William McKinley, President McKinley, who was president during the American-Spanish War. And I think Teddy Roosevelt was, he stormed up the hill in Cuba, didn't he? I mean, he was one of the commanders during that period, and a big fan of war, and a big fan of that war. Right? Jimmy Carter. Somebody says Jimmy Carter was a really bad president. Yeah, but not on the scale of Woodrow Wilson, not on the scale of the FDR, not even on the scale of Obama or Trump. So, the role of government, as I've said here many, many times, as Ayn Rand, of course, articulated in her writings, the role of government is to protect individual rights. The role of the American government is to protect the individual rights of Americans. It should go to war only when the individual rights of Americans are threatened, when the life and property of Americans is threatened, and when the only way to deal with that threat is to go to war. Spain did not, as far as I know, my history, Spain did not really threaten the individual rights of America. It did not require a global war against Spain in the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century to protect the individual rights of Americans. There was no threat to the individual rights of Americans during World War I. Europeans could have continued to slaughter each other for years, and America would have been fine. Would have been fine. Oh, better to have peace, better to have trading partners, better that Europe be a peaceful place, but you don't go to war for better. You go to war when the individual rights of your citizens are threatened, their lives are threatened. There was no reason for the United States to enter the Korean War, a war that saw thousands and thousands of Americans die for what? For South Korea to become a free, prosperous country? Koreans should fight for a free, prosperous South Korea. Why should Americans? American military should be used only the protection of the individual rights of Americans. Not Koreans, not Vietnamese, not anybody's, not Europeans. So again, the great tragedy, when you think about Memorial Day, is the number of American soldiers who have died over the last 250 years for the wrong reason, for the wrong purpose, defending the wrong principles. In other words, not defending this great country. And indeed, one doesn't have to look backwards in order to see that. But all one has to do is read the newspaper. Why? Oh, why? Oh, God, oh, why? Americans dying today in Afghanistan. For what purpose? To protect whom? Why is Donald Trump trying to negotiate a peace deal with the Taliban? If you want the troops home, bring them home. And to hell with what happens in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. Let the Afghans fight it out. They're going to do it anyway, peace deal or not. Get the troops out of harm's way. Now, we lost that war. We lost that war a decade ago. Why do we perpetuate death? Death among our own people. Death among our own children. For the sake of whom? For the sake of what? So Memorial Day should be a day to get angry. Angry at the fact that our politicians will not do the right thing, do not care about the lives of our own kids. That most Americans, 90% of Americans, do not seem to care about their own kids. Now, we could win in Afghanistan if we wanted to, but clearly there's no will to win. Clearly there's no ambition to do what is necessary to win that war. So get out. We lost it. It's done. Forget about it. If they become a threat again, maybe we'll have to go bomb the hell out of them again. But for now, there's no point. I said this about Iraq in 2000, I can't remember, 2005, 4 or 5. I said enough's enough. We've lost the war. This is before the surge. I think the surge cemented our loss. And more American kids had to die for that. What's the point in fighting wars where we're going to lose? So I called for bringing back the troops in 2004, I think it was, from the Iraq War, because it was obvious we had lost. It was obvious we were not willing to do what was necessary to win. And if you're not willing to do what's necessary to win, at least don't die in a losing cause. So to me, it's horrific. We've got troops all over the world. Doing what? Protecting Americans? I don't think you need troops in 100 countries to protect Americans. I don't think we need troops everywhere around the world. In order to protect the individual rights of Americans. You only need troops in the world out there in places that are necessary for the protection of the individual rights of Americans. And when they go to war, they should be provided. They are Americans too. They're not sacrificial fodder. They're not to be sacrificed for the good of the state, for the good of society, for the common good. They have individual rights. And as such, we should never send our kids to war unless we're willing to win. We should never send our kids to war unless we're willing to give them the tools to defeat the enemy. We should never send our kids to war to be sacrificed for the enemy, as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. We should never send our kids to war tying their hands behind their backs so that they cannot shoot, so they cannot defend themselves. We should never send our kids to war unless we're willing to do whatever is necessary to protect them while allowing them to win. To win. And yet, that is what we do, constantly. Again, we have troops all around the world, not protecting America, not protecting our interests, but protecting other people. And we tie their hands behind their backs. We value the civilian population of Iraq more than we value our own children. We value the civilian population of Afghanistan more than we value our own children. So, somebody posted a smear of me in a conservative journal the other day. They were attacking Bradley Thompson's article about the new right, the Nietzschean nihilistic right. And as part of that, they attacked me because I'm a co-author with Brad on a book on neoconservatism. And they attacked me, they looked me up on Wikipedia, and they discovered that I'm what's called for the flattening of Fallujah. And they said, oh my God, the inhumanity of flattening Fallujah. How could you have a strategy a military strategy that involves killing civilians. And my question is, how can you have a military strategy that involves killing your own kids? How can you have a military strategy that involves sacrificing your own children for the sake of Iraqi civilians? Of course, I got no answer. I was called a monster. I asked them if they thought Truman was a monster, or Churchill was a monster, or Sherman was a monster for killing civilians in order to protect their own troops. I got no answer. But that's modern conservatives. They're sellouts. They're not about American self-interest. They're about altruism. They're about Christian altruism. They're all happy to sacrifice somebody else's children for the common good, for nation building, for so-called American interests, which they cannot never define. So yeah, if you care about troops, if you care about the soldiers, if you care about America, bring all those kids home. Deploy them only where they're needed. And deploy them with the resources to win and to protect their own lives. Pretty simple foreign policy. Pretty simple approach. And it's the only patriotic approach. I want to talk about two things. One is, do soldiers sacrifice? Well, it depends. I don't think soldiers have to sacrifice. I think a soldier who knows why he's fighting, that he's fighting for a cause that is essential to his own life, a cause that is crucial to his own life, a cause that he would rather not live if he didn't fight for, a cause that if he lost, he wouldn't want to live, the cause of freedom, the cause of his own freedom, of his family's freedom, of his friends' freedom, of the freedom of people he loves and cares for. Then it is not a sacrifice. Then he is fighting for freedom, he's fighting for liberty, he's fighting for an abstract idea. He's not committing suicide. But he realizes that if he doesn't fight, then who will? And that liberty and freedom are worth risking one's life for. And that is not a sacrifice. That is fighting for a supreme value. So soldiers don't have to sacrifice. Now, if they're sent into a war with their hands tied behind their backs, yes, they're being sacrificed. And it's that Judeo-Christian tradition, by the way, particularly the Christian tradition, that sacrifices them, that makes it impossible for them to fight full on to protect themselves. So it's Christianity's view of turning the other cheek, loving your enemy, love thy neighbor like yourself, all of that crap that leads us to sacrifice some for the sake of others. In this case, our soldiers for the sake of civilians in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere. So the second question is a question of patriotism. Now, I consider myself an American patriot. I'm an immigrant to this country. I chose to come here. But I'm an American patriot in the sense of what I think America means. I'm not a patriot of particular borders or a particular nation, but what the nation represents, and in America's case, what the nation represents in its founding documents. As the founding documents become less relevant, as America ceases to represent those American values, I am less patriotic. As I see the people who claim to be great patriots and great lovers of America, the so-called conservatives, or the conservatives, not so-called, the real conservatives, turning away from the founding. You should read some of the criticism at the conservative magazines of Brad Thompson's book on the Declaration of Independence. as they turn away from the founding, as they reject our founding fathers, as they reject the Declaration of Independence, as they reject the very ideas that made America America. And these are the conservatives. We know the left has rejected all that long ago. What is left of this country to be patriotic about? As I see the sense of life of Americans whittled away, except being locked away because of a virus. I'm not talking about New Yorkers who really were threatened, but I'm talking about people all over America where this virus represented an insignificant threat to their lives. And yet, they calmly, acceptingly locked themselves at home and accepted checks from the government to bail themselves out. And not a peep out of them. A few demonstrations here, a few demonstrations there. Demonstrations weren't particularly American in my view, but a few demonstrations here, a few demonstrations there. But acceptance of authoritarianism. In that sense, I did a show, I can't remember what it was, and I said a while back, I can't remember if the name of the show was this, but in that sense, we're all China now. We're all China now, you know. They locked down the Chinese city. Nobody said a word. Everybody said, yes, sir. How can we help? And it's not that the virus is not a threat. I completely recognize the virus as a threat, and I am completely against people who try to minimize the threat that is the virus. It's the idea of shutting down, of closing up, of locking people away, of mandating that they do that, even in places where the threat was minimal. And it's not even that. It's the fact that people just accepted it. Not a peep. Then where's the American sense of life? So what does it mean to be patriotic today about America? Almost nobody knows what the founding principles are. The people who claim, the conservatives, to be for the founding principles don't believe in them anymore and are moving us closer and closer to authoritarianism, or at least they would like to. Whether they're successful or not is a different story. And the American people, those people that Ayn Rand loved so much, that I loved so much, because of their sense of life, their unmitigated love of freedom and liberty, seems to have faded. You know, Leonard Peikoff gave an amazing talk right after 9/11. It must have been 2002. Called Americans versus America. How Americans have turned against the ideas of America. How Americans don't represent America anymore, and how the sense of life of Americans is dying. And that's hard to be patriotic. So my patriotism is about the memory of America. About America, what America used to be, what America can still be, I think. But about the idea of America, which I would like to see resurrected somewhere on the globe at some point in time. And of course, we romanticize the past, but World War I was in the past, and many, many Americans supported that war, and many, many Americans went to their death, quite happily it would seem, to fight in that war. And many, many Americans romanticized war, and romanticized World War I. And if you read stories of that period, you can see that. And yet, it was not a war for America. It was not an American war. It was not a necessary war. It was just slaughter for no reason. So, there were problems in America in the past as well. But America always came through and seemed to always rebound and re-engage with those founding principles. Re-engage with that American sense of life. And let's hope that happens this time too. Let's hope that 9/11, the financial crisis, the coronavirus have not dwindled the American sense of life so much that there's nothing to come back to, nothing to come back for. That the ideas, let's hope there's somebody still keeping the flame of those ideas alive. Certainly, that is my hope, and that is what I try to do. You could talk about the fact that I'm an objectivist and the ideas that I'm preaching Ayn Rand, but really the ideas that I'm advocating for are American ideas. They're ideas of the founders. Yes, they will. I don't agree with them on everything, and they certainly, who knows what they would have thought of my ideas, and suddenly they were more Christian than I would like them to be, and they were more religious than I'd like them to be, but far less Christian, far less religious than conservatives are today, than Americans are today. So I view myself as a defender of the American founding, a defender of Americanism. And in that context, wait a minute. Yeah, it's right here. Here's the book, right? This is what is worth fighting for. This is what patriotism should mean. It's the love of Americanism, a love of America as represented by the idea that it was founded on. And here Ayn Rand articulates her vision for what America is, what it should be, what it can be, to some extent what it was. The America that the founders founded, not the America of pseudo-ignorant intellectuals of today who value their Christianity more than they do this great and amazing country. So I encourage everybody to pick up a copy. It was edited by Jonathan Honing, who was on the chat before. It's got an essay of Ayn Rand's that you can't find anywhere else. And it's got an essay of mine somewhere here. I think I wrote something here. Yes, I did. And a number of others. I mean, there's some terrific stuff here that I highly recommend. There's Ayn Rand's textbook on Americanism, where she articulates her vision of what America is. There's American Political Philosophy. So what is American Political Philosophy? By Onkargate, which is an excellent article. Jonathan Honing has an essay here on property rights. And, a lot more. And then there's more of Ayn Rand, some never released some text of her workshop on ethics and politics, which is just gems, just amazing content. My essay is about bringing it up to today, textbook of Americanism today, some issues that one needs to address if one addresses America today. And then Brad Thompson has an essay on Americanism and the Spirit of Liberty. So some really excellent stuff in the book. I highly recommend it. It is a great book to purchase on Memorial Day. You should go now to Amazon and get your copy. It's a great book to read anytime and to remind yourself of what this country is. Because you won't find this kind of definition of America anyway. I mean, unfortunately, I spent the day today reading some journal articles by a variety of different conservatives, and it's very depressing. It's very depressing. The American right is either bankrupt or completely and utterly corrupt. It's been corrupted by the alt-right in ways that I never imagined when I first did a show on the alt-right 4 years ago. The alt-right has been mainstreamed. Anyway, we'll do a show on that. I was preparing for a show, but then I decided to talk about Memorial Day. So, patriotism is wonderful, but not for a piece of land, not for a border, but for a vision of what is possible, for a country that represents a vision. And America was that vision, did represent that vision. And that is fading, and that is sad. And Memorial Day is a time to remember what's worth fighting for in America. The freedom, the liberty, before it disappears. All right. That is my monologue. Let's see. We've got some super chat questions. Let me see if I've got them all. Yep. We got them all. Yes, if you want to add super chat questions, go ahead. I've got some from yesterday, So I'm going to cover the ones from yesterday first, and then I'll get to the ones from today. So don't push it with the questions right now, because let's see how many of these I can get through. The first one is on China. I was actually going to do a whole show today on China. But let's see. What would China have to do to be considered an... Well, wait a minute. There was something before this. There we go. How do we deal with China? They have nukes. That's one. What would China have to do to be considered an enemy? Does their genocide against their own people matter? Does their actions last week in Hong Kong matter? Okay, so let me break it down. I've done China and what we should do about China many times. So let me try to do it quickly and break it down for you. Number one, how do we deal with China? Well, my view right now, we deal with China is, and I've said this, I don't think Trump can do it. I don't think Biden can do it. So I don't know who's going to do it. Nobody in today's politics can do this. But what needs to be done is we need to cut off diplomatic relationship with China. We need to bring our ambassador home. We need to stop all government funding that might be going to China in any kind of direct or indirect way. We need to establish an embassy immediately in Taiwan and declare that the Taiwanese government is a good government and that the Chinese government is a bad government. That we reject authoritarianism, that we reject the police state that China has become, that we reject the morality of their central planning, the morality of their civilian state. And then I think we need to leave them alone. Again, I'm not for tariffs. I'm not for restrictions on trade, because I don't think restrictions on trade are issues the government should deal with. If you don't want to trade with China, don't. But we should. The things the government does is it participates in organizations with other countries. I think we should leave the United Nations. The United States should leave the United Nations. Or we should ask the United Nations to kick out China. But I think it's much more likely the United States should leave the United Nations. No organization which refuses to accept Taiwan but embraces China should be an organization the United States participates in. That's a simple principle. So get rid of an embassy as part of a more broader program of getting rid of embassies in all countries that are authoritarian. We shouldn't have an embassy in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Dubai or Bahrain or any of the Middle Eastern countries other than Israel. We shouldn't have embassies in Vietnam and in other countries. And it's questionable whether we should have an embassy, probably shouldn't have an embassy in Russia. We should withdraw a moral sanction from any authoritarian regime, from any regime that enslaves its own people. Now, what would China have to do to be considered an enemy? We would have to assess that China is acting to kill Americans or to destroy American property. For example, if China builds up troops or builds up a navy that seems to be a threat to Hawaii or a threat to the west coast of the United States, and there's reason to believe they're going to deploy it, not just a theoretical. Or for example, if China says it's an enemy, like Iran does, like if they start every day chanting death to Americans, and we're going to launch a nuclear weapons against you, and we're going to kill Americans wherever we can, like the Iranians do. Iran is an enemy. Or like the North Korean little murderous dictator who periodically threatens to launch missiles in the United States. If you threaten to launch a missile against us, you're our enemy, and we should do whatever we can to destroy you. Not befriend you, not hug you, not negotiate with you, not pretend that you're our best friend, destroy you. Now, the destruction might be covert. We might poison you or shoot you or assassinate you. We might launch a war against you. We might do a lot of things, or we might just embargo you. So China would have to actually act against the United States or constitute a real threat. Now, for example, if China actively, and it does this today, but in a scenario we have clearly announced our foreign policy, and China continues to use cyber warfare against us, to hack our systems, to crash our computers, to steal information off of American computers, that is an act of war, and they should know that we consider that an act of war. And maybe that act of war, the result of it is that we use cyber technologies to crash every computer in China. In other words, we retaliate. Or it could mean we embargo them. Or it could be we send our Navy to their waters and surround them. It could be a lot of things, depending on the military circumstances. And given that they're a nuclear power, we have to be careful because you do not want to get involved in a nuclear war. But there are a lot of things we can do if we believe they've acted in a warlike behavior towards us. Now, they're hacking today, I don't think is an act of war because we don't conceive of it that way. We haven't threatened them. We haven't told them. But if we do and they continue to doing it, then you have to consider things like embargoes. You have to consider things like using cyber to destroy their capabilities. Does their genocide against their own people matter? Sure, it matters. It matters in your moral evaluation of them. But it doesn't matter in considering them an enemy. You know, lots of countries do horrible things to their own people. Doesn't make them an enemy of the United States. They have to do horrible things to Americans to make them an enemy of the United States. Does their action in last week in Hong Kong matter? Absolutely, again, for the moral evaluation of them. And, you know, for our relationship with Hong Kong. But the fact is we do not have a defense treaty with Hong Kong. We're not committing to defending Hong Kong. I don't think American troops should die to defend Hong Kong. But we should make it clear to the Chinese, we consider their behavior abhorrent. We consider their whole form of government abhorrent. Again, something Trump would never do, something no president would ever do. Actually say, we consider the Chinese form of government immoral, anti-life, anti-American, evil. And their attempts to expand, we consider that an expansion of evil. When that expansion involves a threat to the United States, beware. Now, I was going to do a whole show today on the rise of China and the decline of the United States, and I will do that maybe later this week. There's more to say about China in that context, in the context of their successes and our failures, but I'll leave that for a separate show. I said something about Spider-Man not getting the girl based on my very limited knowledge of Spider-Man in one of my talks, and based on my limited knowledge of Spider-Man, I guess from the movies, because I never read the cartoons. Somebody says Spider-Man always gets the girl, Mary Jane, Black Cat, Gwen Stacy, etc. The problem is Peter Parker being a nerd who gets bullied. But Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And Peter Parker never gets the girl. And to that extent, Spider-Man never gets the girl because Spider-Man, to get the girl, would have to take off his costume. How do you get the girl without the costume? With the costume on. Getting the girl means more than just she admires you. Getting the girl means more than she goes gaga over you. Getting the girl means having a relationship with that girl. Spider-Man cannot have a relationship with the girl. Spider-Man has to sacrifice a relationship with the girl because he's Peter Parker. Not because he's a nerd, but because, if I remember the movies at least, he is afraid that the evil guys will go after the girl. But that's how the whole drama is positioned. You're either a good or you're happy. Spider-Man, to the extent that he's good, cannot be happy. That's how it's positioned. I didn't create it. They didn't have to create Peter Parker as a nerd. They could have created Peter Parker as somebody completely different. It's a choice. The choice to make him that way creates certain conflict. The conflict between goodness and happiness. And that's a conventional conflict. And it's philosophically consistent with people's approach to life. John Mackey published a book, Unconscious Capitalism, in 2013. He seems to like capitalism with an altruist slant, absolutely. Why do you think he refused to debate me? I think he turned down debating me because I think he's debated other people on the topic, and he didn't. What's he got to gain from debating me? He debated John Allison once. He debated, I think, David Kelly. So he's debated other people. I don't think he thinks he has anything to gain from debating me. He's famous. He's got a big institute called Conscious Capitalism. Businessmen from all over the country support him because it's great. You get to be capitalist, and you get to keep your altruism. How cool is that? So who's against? Nobody's against conscious capitalism, except me, who I'm for unconscious capitalism. No, of course I'm not. I'm for capitalism. There's only one capitalism. And I don't think it's conscious in the altruistic sense. So the issue of why people don't debate me is you always got to think about, I don't think it's that they're afraid. It's what do they have to gain by it? Usually the people who agree to debate me are young, starting out in their careers. They've got nothing to lose, and they've got something to gain. But, I mean, I've debated a few more senior, older people, but it's hard to get somebody prominent to debate me because they've got nothing to gain and something to lose. If Trump gets elected a second term, you said that will pave the way for an AOC to come to power. Well, for an AOC-like candidate, for even more leftist candidates, and for the complete and utter destruction of the Republican Party. What happens if Biden gets elected? Does that set in motion a nationalist 4 years later like a Tucker Carlson? I mean, possibly. But it at least solidifies some success for the center, for the left of center Democrats. So it gives some life to the non-crazy leftist Democrats. Biden is, not particularly good, but he's nowhere near Elizabeth Warren or AOC or Bernie Sanders. And it gives an opportunity for the Republicans to fight it out. One of the advantages of Trump losing is that maybe, just maybe, I'm not guaranteeing this, but maybe, this whole nationalist viewpoint is viewed as wrong. That is, if Trump loses, and part of that loss is attributed to his particular view of building a wall and tariffs and the whole attitude of American nationalism and economic nationalism is wrong, then maybe the Republicans will choose somebody different next time. On the other hand, it could be that if Trump loses, Republicans go, well, it wasn't the ideas that lost, it was a personality. And what we need next time is somebody with more charisma, somebody better, somebody more articulate, somebody less nutty, less crazy, and that they nominate a Tucker Carlson or somebody like that. And that's really possible. And I'm sure, I know that most Trump fans would love Tucker Carlson. I don't know that he could win the nomination, but I think the Trump core, and including objectivists who voted for Trump, would vote for Tucker Carlson, even though he's an abomination, right? So I don't know what happens, but if Trump wins, then not only does it pave the way for AOC or the left of the left, but I think then it paves the way for the nationalists, because then it says, if even somebody as controversial, let's say, as Donald Trump can get elected with this nationalist agenda. Whoa, what if you had somebody even smarter? What if you had somebody more sane, win in a landslide? So, Trump could be paving the way for a crazy leftist, or it could be paving the way for even more charismatic nationalist who could bring us much closer to authoritarianism. But that's what happens with the Trump win. With the Trump win, both parties go further out. Democrats give up on the center and go way to the left. Republicans give up on the center. There's no center anymore in the Republican Party. And it can't be reborn because another 4 years of Trump will crush it even further. So all you get in future elections are socialists versus nationalists. And of course, the union of those two is what Tucker Carlson is, National Socialists, right? Nationalists, statists, socialists. So I think a Trump second term is a disaster for this country, no matter how it evolves. And I think that Biden buys us some time to fight those tendencies within the Republican Party, to maybe see a more moderate or a more centrist approach rise up, or a more free market approach rise up. If Trump wins, the free market part of the Republican Party is dead forever, for a very, very long time. Already, it's on its dying deathbed. But if he wins again, it's finished, completely finished. That's why I think it's so important to defeat Trump this time and give us some chance, give us an opportunity to find somebody better, to find a better Republicans who can rebuild the party from there. Let me hear couple of other questions about Republicans. I gave Trump and the Republicans credit because they seem to be proud to be America, qua American. Do you give them any credit for that? No, because I don't think they are American, qua American, because I don't think they know what America is. Or is their understanding of Americanism too shallow? It's not just too shallow, it's wrong. It's just not a right understanding. Trump has no conception of the Declaration of Independence. He has no conception of individual rights, no conception of the Constitution, no conception of the Enlightenment and what the Enlightenment represented and what America represents. It's not that it's shallow, it's that it's non-existent. It's not existent. He does not love America. He loves Donald Trump in some shallow sense. He loves kind of the image he has of New York and America and whatever. But he doesn't love America. Not if America means this moral country founded on certain principles. I mean, do you remember, somebody reminded me of this, do you remember when he was on television, and I saw this, so you can't tell me this is fake news. I saw him say this. He's interviewed on television about Putin, and the interviewer asks him, well, what do you think about, something like, don't you blame Putin for killing journalists? And Trump says, well, America kills people too. I mean, he does not believe in American exceptionalism. He is like the left. He is no different than the left. He does not believe in American exceptionalism. He does not believe this is a great country. He believes this is a country like everybody else. What's the difference between America and Russia? Nothing. They kill journalists, we kill people. And of course, when he behaves in such a respectful way to the dictators of the world, from Putin to the princes of Saudi Arabia to the murderous, dictator of North Korea, to Xi in China, who he constantly talks about with immense respect, instead of judging him and condemning him. I mean, forget tariffs, forget trade, just admit that Xi is a brutal dictator, is an authoritarian, who is immoral. So, no, Trump loves authoritarians. That's not American. There's no pride in America there. There's the opposite. There's a hatred for what America really is. But of course, he doesn't even know what that is. I really think Trump is one of the most ignorant people there is. I don't think he knows much about anything. Now, he claims to know stuff about medicine. He claims to know stuff about all kinds of things, but I don't think he actually knows anything. I don't think he reads, and I don't think you can know much without reading. I don't think he reads. I think he watches television. Television won't teach you anything about anything. I don't think he's ever really read. I mean, he's a marketing guy. He's a philanderer, a party animal. He's good at what he did in real estate, and that's it. And yeah, Andrew says, Trump thinks America is great because he was born here. That's right. That's exactly right. And that's not what makes America great. Not because he was born here, not because you guys were born here. I was born somewhere else. I came here because of what America represents. I don't think there's a difference between Trump's sense of life of America and Pelosi, Biden, AOC, except that Trump mouths the words that you guys blindly respond to. But in his soul, he doesn't love this country. He doesn't respect this country. He doesn't know what this country's about. He has no clue what this country's about. Indeed, on Memorial Day, what did he do? He played golf. It's supposed to be Memorial Day. He really is a leftist in the sense that remember that interview about Putin? America kills people too. Big deal that he killed journalists. That's not an American. It's not an American response. It's not an American attitude. That's Nancy Pelosi. That's a leftist attitude to America. America killed people too. There's no difference. I used to say that Obama was the first American president who was anti-American. And Trump is the second. But if you think there's a difference, why? Because he says America, make America great again, but he doesn't know what that is. He has no clue what American greatness is. He has no clue what America represents to the world and what caused America to be great, what brought American greatness about. None of that. It's not an issue of America being innocent. You're making a moral equivocation between America and Putin's Russia. If Obama had done that, you would be all over him. You would be condemning him. You would be ridiculing him. You would be calling him anti-American. I remember when Obama bowed to the king of Saudi Arabia, what people like Christopher Smith here on the chat, what they said about Obama. Well, when Trump went and danced with the Saudi princess, the Arab little dance, what did you say? Nothing. He's an American president. He's just, he's wonderful. He's a patriot. He hasn't walked circles around anybody. What Trump has done is he's a great marketer. He's found what will sell Americans. He's found the people in America that will vote for him if he pushes certain buttons. And he's figured out how to push those buttons. But he has not outsmarted anybody on the international front. And on a domestic front, yeah, he's got 90% or whatever the percentage is of the Republican Party. But that's sad. That's a statement about America. It's not a statement about Trump. He's figured out how to manipulate all of you. And he's brilliant at it. He is a brilliant marketer and manipulator. Brilliant. I've never seen anybody do it better. And he ran a brilliant campaign. Not a brilliant campaign in terms of ideas, not a brilliant campaign in terms of truth, not a brilliant campaign in terms of value. He ran a brilliant campaign in terms of lying and manipulating and pushing the buttons necessary to get you to vote for him. And he succeeded. Greg says on Facebook, and I agree completely, Trump is actively hostile to everything essential about America. Everything essential to America. Everything essential about the idea of America. That's me elaborating. There's no such thing as loving a country by being indifferent to its moral character. If you think America is just like Russia, then you don't love America. You don't love America. And I'm not saying he's the only one. As I said, Obama was anti-American. He did the same thing. He had moral equivocation. There's no difference between America and all the other countries in the world. We should never lead. We should follow. You saw that in Libya and other places. Not that I know why we went to Libya to begin with, but you saw it over and over again in the way he dealt with other world leaders from a position of humility, and we're just like everybody else. And Trump has taken that to the next level. We're just as bad as everybody else. But we're going to be great because this is my country. My country. All right, we got a few more super chats. Any advice from your experience as a dad about being better speaking communications with teenage kids? Not lecturing, limiting the points, active listening, stories. So I don't know that I was particularly good dad to teenage kids. It's a long time ago. I hesitate to give any advice about it because I'm just not sure that I know anything special about it. Anyway, I just don't know that I've got anything particularly useful to say about teenage kids. If you ask me about younger kids, I know more, but teenage kids, I'm not sure I know anything. At what point does a private business entity become a fascist entity due to government controls of property? I don't think of entities as fascist. Fascism is a system of government. I was reading an article today about fascism. It's interesting. You know, fascism is a system of government basically created, invented by Mussolini. I mean, there's a bunch of intellectuals writing at the time, but Mussolini really is the guy who really he came up with the term, and he created the first fascist government, and he created a unique form of government. And what is always surprising is that when we study history, Mussolini always comes across as a buffoon, as a ridiculous character, as kind of a sidekick to Hitler, right? But this evil, buffoonish kind of character, stupid and mumbling, an idiot. But he wasn't. He was incredibly smart, you know, really brilliant. He was, in his youth, he was a socialist. And, you know, he met Lenin once, and Lenin once chastised the Socialist Party of Italy for letting him go because he was the rising star. He was going to be the rising star of the socialist communists in Italy. And, you know, at some point, he realized that he never really gave up on certain principles of socialism, but what he realized was or he came to believe that socialism was ineffective. And think about this, because there's certain parallels to today. He came to believe that class conflict, which is the essence of socialism, the essence of communism or Marxism, was wrong. And there was a fundamental unity among the classes. And that the unity was a unity around the nation, around the state. And that socialism, in a sense, had to be sacrificed. The ideas of socialism had to be sacrificed. And the class struggle had to be ended. And that the class problems could be resolved through the lens of the common good of a nation. And it was the job of the nation to solve the class problems. So he didn't reject Marxism in the Marxist view of these struggles between workers and factory owners, between the capitalists and the working class. But he rejected that conflict inevitably would lead to a revolution of the workers against, and he rejected the internationalism of socialism. That the state didn't matter. That what matters was the dictatorship of the proletariat across all borders. Remember, communism is an international movement, an anti-state, anti-nation movement. And he saw the nation as solving the problems that socialism and then Marx had identified, the alienation and the exploitation that is at the heart of Marxist ideology. And he created a system of government to reflect that. And so when I think of fascism, I don't think of, well, that's a fascist company. A company with heavy government involvement is a crony company or a semi-private company or a private-public partnership, they call it, right? Which is a horrible term. Fascism is a system of government. Now, I think that America is much more fascist than it is socialist. It's much closer to fascism than it is to socialism. And I think most mixed economies in the West are much closer to fascism than they are to socialism. And I remember when Obama was president, I once went on television, and they were asking me about Obama as a socialist. I said, no, Obama's not a socialist. He's a fascist. Almost everybody in America is a fascist. Because what is fascism? What was Mussolini's version of fascism? Fascism did not originally involve racism or racism. For example, Italians don't view themselves as one race, and there was no real racism in Italy. And Mussolini originally, early on, was not anti-Semitic. There was not a lot of anti-Semitism in Italy. It only came later under Hitler's influence. But the original fascism was about the nation, Italy, no matter what your race within the nation was. And it was focused on the state, and it was focused on central planning, but not central planning in the socialist sense. Fascism left the factories and the factory owner where they were. They left the workers where they were. But what the fascists did was control the factory owner and the unions. You have to remember, and the workers. And both the workers and the factory owners, both the workers and the capitalists and the entrepreneurs, under fascism are basically controlled by the state. And therefore, that's how you resolve the conflict between them. The state figures out what the right relationship between them should be, how much they should be paid, minimum wage or some kind of wage control, right? Price controls. And it figures out what the factory owner should produce up to a point. Right? So it leaves the factory owner with a pretense that they are still have ownership of things. And it leaves the worker with a pretense that they're still getting paid for their productive effort. But really, the state is dictating from above how it should all behave. So the state doesn't own the means of production. It controls the means of production. And it controls the workers. But it doesn't pay the workers directly. Again, it's not quite as expansive in its central planning as communism is. So I think in America, we've suddenly taken significant steps towards fascism. When we dictate wages, when we limit CEO pay, which we do to some extent through the tax code, when we try to tell companies what they can and cannot produce, when we set prices for certain goods, when we tell companies where they can and cannot build a factory in the United States or out of the United States, when we dictate importation of what can and cannot be imported, when we tell CEOs not to shut down a plant like Trump has done, a factory of Ford or GM or whatever. Or what was it? There was the air conditioning company, I think, as well. The more regulated, the more controlled, the more manipulated the industry is, the more the government controls them in spite of them feeling like they have private property, the more fascist our regime is, the more fascist our system is, not a particular company, but the system. Now, I don't think we're fully fascist yet. There's still a lot of domains in which people make private decisions, whether it is salaries and how much to pay people and how much to ask, whether it's still some independent unions, whether it is still freedom of entrepreneurs to create and to build and to make stuff and not to ask for permission. You know, again, there's some regulation, but the regulations are somewhat limited. So we're on the path to fascism. Actually, this article was interesting because it said, you know, while the left blames almost everybody on the right for being a fascist, the left is just as fascist when it comes to, if you actually understand the economics of fascism. The left is just as fascist. The left, you know, the left still wants to control industry in the same kind of way. Not in a socialist way. Almost nobody on the left wants to actually own the means of production. Elizabeth Warren doesn't want to nationalize factories, but she wants to control factories. She doesn't want to make all workers government employees, or for that matter, she doesn't want to overturn ownership of factories and hand it over to the workers. But she wants to be able to control wages. She wants to be able to control all these things. In many ways, the left and the right today both have the same economic plan, with some slight variation, and both are fundamentally fascist economic plans. Now, you could argue fascism is a form of socialism, which is what Ayn Rand does. But I think it's useful to have these distinctions in terms of the way they play out. And I think today, almost all mixed economies are predominantly lean fascist rather than socialist. The only socialist aspect of it is the welfare state, the massive redistribution of wealth. But even that, you know, I think Mussolini had in fascist Italy. So I don't think that's unique to socialism. And of course, Germany invented the welfare state under Bismarck, and Bismarck certainly wasn't a socialist. He was indeed the reason my understanding is, I'm not an historian, I'm certainly not an expert on 19th century Germany, but my understanding is that Bismarck instituted a welfare state in an attempt to defeat the socialists. In a sense, what he said is, oh, you don't need the socialists to give you the goodies, I can give it to you, right? So the welfare state is not unique to socialism, it is unique to statism, and in this case, it's a part of the fascist way of doing business. So I do think we're not fully fascist, but certainly the way our government structures our economic activity leans more fascist than to anything else. And that would be true Democrats or Republicans. And again, Republicans talk the talk of free markets. They just don't walk the walk. Does welfare bailouts let people evade reality? Yes, but not evade the consequences of reality, as Ayn Rand always said. So yeah, they evade their own need to produce, the psychological self-esteem need, requirement to be human, to be happy, to be successful at living, that productiveness involves. By getting welfare, by getting a bailout, by getting a check from the government, they evade that. But the consequence of that is they're not happy, and they never gain the self-esteem, and they don't live fully human lives. And I think that's the great tragedy of the welfare state is less that they take my money and give it to somebody else. It's less that they take my money, it's more that they give it to them. My life is destroyed a little bit, their life is destroyed completely. So we're both losers. Welfare state is a lose-lose transaction. I lose because I have less. They lose because they don't have the opportunity, the incentive to break out and gain the self-esteem that work requires. And if you look at certain neighborhoods, if you look at certain groups, they've been institutionalized into poverty by over and over and over being told, no, don't worry, don't try, don't make an effort. We'll just help you. We'll bail you out. We'll give you this stuff. We'll give you the goodies. And imagine the psychology of that, generation after generation being taught that they are just, should be, and should be happy to be, dependents of the state. Is the U.S. an empire in practical terms? No, it's not. I mean, in a sense, an empire would be better, but because it's a hodgepodge of foreign policy that doesn't add up to anything. It's a bunch of troops in 100 countries whose mission is ambiguous and doesn't mean anything. Yes, there's kind of a global fight against terrorism, but which terrorism? Who's a threat to America? Who are these terrorists? Why are we fighting them locally, pinpointing them? Why are we going after the source? There's no empire here. There's no cohesive, there's no integrating idea or integrating strategy. There's just incompetence and disintegration and lack of coherence and inertia and fear of retreat, a fear of change, a fear of dramatically changing things. And it doesn't matter who's president. It's not like Trump is any different than Obama, who is any different than Bush, who is any different than Clinton. They all just, there's this drift. Oh, there's a country over there in trouble. Let's send some troops there. And there's one over there. Let's send some troops there. And they never come home. So they're there forever. And then we add on countries and keep adding on countries. Oh, there's a little terrorist organization there. Let's send troops. I mean, if they're really a threat, why don't we just annihilate them and come home? Well, oh, you can't do annihilation because that's not anti-Christian. And I was told by this conservative leader on Twitter that I was this horrible person. And my strategy of warfare was inhumane. So no, we're not an empire. We're not anything in that sense. We don't have a foreign policy. We haven't had a foreign policy in decades. We have no clue what we're doing in the world. We don't occupy land. That's what an empire would require. An empire would require that we actually occupy land. I mean, if we were an empire, we wouldn't have troops in 100 countries. We'd have administrators in 100 countries. And those administrators would be running those countries. We don't even do that. Not that I'm advocating for that, but we don't do that. We don't try to take over countries. We don't try to write their constitutions. We don't try to get them to even pursue our interests. We have troops in countries that hate our guts and whose governments work against us. That's not empire. I mean, the British Empire had a coherent strategy. It was very flawed and very bad, but there's no empire here. Empire requires a level of competence that we don't have. How can certain thinkers be so right and profound in one area, yet completely dishonest and irrational in others? I mean, most people are like that. I don't know if most, but a lot of people are like that. I mean, think about the people who are great at their jobs and just are horrible everywhere else. Not horrible in the sense that they treat other people badly, but treat themselves badly. They're unhappy. They're, whether it's in a romantic life or whether it's in just living and just having a purpose in life. They might be good at programming, but nothing else. And a lot of thinkers, Ayn called it compartmentalization. I think that's a known term in psychology, I assume. But they compartmentalize. They have this part of their life, they do this, and this other part of their life, they can't handle it because it comes up against some psychological issue or some other ideological issue that prevents them. They might be ruthlessly selfish in their, ruthlessly in the good way, selfish in the good way, in their work, and then be completely altruistic in their private life. Right? Or they could be a great mathematician and terrible in politics, or a great businessman, and not be able to translate the kind of thinking, reason, into the realm of politics, or the realm of other things. It's called compartmentalization. It's a consequence of not encouraging, teaching, modeling integration. One of the great geniuses of Ayn Rand is the fact that it's an integrated system. Everything you do in life unites into one whole, and everything's connected to everything. And you can't have something over here that is not related in some way to these other things. And if it's not, one has to question what it is, right? So that is not taught, that is not believed in, that is not modeled. And people don't know how to do that. And certainly our educational system doesn't encourage integration, but that's what is required. And unfortunately, people are not integrated, they're disintegrated. And it expresses itself in compartmentalization. What do you think of Daniel Henniger of the Wall Street Journal? I can't remember. I've read some of his stuff that I like a lot. Other stuff was like blah. But he's one of the better writers. Generally, the Wall Street Journal has some good writers, and he's one of the better ones. I miss Bret Stephens in the Wall Street Journal. Again, he was good on some things, terrible on other things. But I don't remember enough to comment more specifically on Daniel. Why has there been less terrorist attacks? Can I gloat a little bit? Because I say stuff like years ago, and people laugh at it and ridicule it and make fun of it and criticize it. Usually the criticism is shallow and silly. And then it turns out I'm right. But by the time it turns out I'm right, nobody remembers what I said and nobody cares, right? Because the crisis is over and nobody knows, right? So, and this has happened to me many times on these issues of terrorism and foreign policy that I actually know something about. And I think it's going to happen about Trump as well and the consequences of this country. But on terrorism, for example, I said, you remember there was a period about, 8 years ago or 6 years ago. Maybe it's longer, maybe it's 6 to 10 years ago. When ISIS was around, and there were a lot of terrorist attacks. There were terrorist attacks in Europe, in London, in France. There was a guy who ran, that monster who drove that truck through a crowd in the south of France on a promenade on the beach. And there were just a lot of terrorist attacks, and it seemed like all the time there were these over and suicide attacks, and using knives and using cars. And there was of course the attack on Charlie Hebdo, and then there was another attack in Paris right after that. So there was this constant, and there were even attacks in Germany, and there was an attack on a train that those Marines stopped, and it just seemed to be like, every month there was something going on in Europe, and the Muslims were taking Europe over, and this is just before and during when the big Muslim immigration into Europe happened, Everybody was like, this is the end of Europe. The terrorists are everywhere. This is endless. It's never going to go away. And I said, no. I said, this can be defeated. I said, there's a short-term solution and there's a long-term solution. The short-term solution is to crush ISIS and destroy it. And people say, but that has nothing to do with it. Because the Muslims are in Europe, they're not in Iraq or Syria. And this is the observation I made, and I stand by it. And this will come up again because terrorism will come back. Nobody wants to die for a losing cause. The reason there was so much terrorism during that period is because ISIS was winning. There was a perception that the Muslims were on the march. There was a perception that another caliphate was going to be established. There was also a clear view of the weakness of the West. ISIS was winning. And winners attract people. People want to be associated with winners. And people are even willing to die for winners, particularly when Islam promises them heaven, 74 virgins or whatever. So, as long as ISIS was thriving politically, succeeding on the military front, had a little caliphate, was challenging the West, rattling their sabers, declaring their superiority, there were Muslims all over Europe willing to volunteer, jump on and go and kill themselves in the name of this winning ideology. But once ISIS was crushed, defeated, demoralized, once the hope of a caliphate was turned to ashes, was eradicated, was eliminated, guess what happened to all those volunteers? It dried up. Nobody is willing to die for a losing cause. Not when it's really losing. Not when it's obvious they cannot win. German soldiers in World War II are far more motivated and fought far more ruthlessly when they were winning than when they started losing. It's hard to be motivated to fight for a losing cause. And that suddenly happened with Muslims. There's far less terrorism in Europe. There's still acts of barbarism. There's still a cultural clash. But in terms of actual terrorism, to terrorize the population in order to achieve some political goal, that is in remission because their shining light has been destroyed. And by the way, I said this would happen. And you can go back and find my podcast from back then where I said this would happen. This was completely predictable. And indeed, if you want to destroy not only Islamic terrorism, but any Islamic ambition, any Islamic pretension of success in the fight against the West, if you want to change the Islamic mind so that instead of thinking how to defeat the West, they think how to join the West, then what you need to do is destroy the remaining remnants of any form of Islamist authoritarianism. Iran, Saudi Arabia, if you really wanted to, the Taliban in Afghanistan. And if that would happen, then the Muslims would leave, their whole motivation, all of that would go away, because they would realize unequivocally and unquestionably the superiority of the West, and unquestionably the fact that they will lose. They are losing, and that they can't succeed. Now, that might happen anyway. Not because the West is strong, indeed the West is unbelievably weak, but because Muslim societies are even weaker. So Iran might fold all by itself. There might be a revolution in Iran to get rid of the mullahs. Saudi Arabia is turning against their Wahhabism already, and that might accelerate. The Taliban might in the end just fail in Afghanistan. So it might well be the case that Islam, political Islam, militant Islam, jihadism, might fail from its own inertia because it's a failed philosophy. It's a failed ideology of governing. We could speed it up if we chose to. We have every reason to. We should be motivated to do it. The last thing you want is one of these Muslim countries, other than Pakistan, which already has it, to get a bomb or to get a real weapon that can be destructive. But if we don't do it, they'll probably self-destruct, and the threat will go away. So again, if you want to eliminate the threat of Islam, you don't have to wage war against all Muslims. All you have to do is destroy any hope they might have of victory, and you do that by eliminating the countries that represent victory in their mind. Iran is number one. Doesn't mean you have to do it. I'm just saying, I think you should. I would do it. But because I think they will die of their own accord. But if you really want to eliminate terrorism, that's what you'd have to do. But look, just defeating ISIS, killing Osama bin Laden, defeating Al-Qaeda has done a lot because they have figured out that they can't win. At least not this round. Not this round. Okay, we got two last questions. Here's one about terrorism again. Is military justice moral? Is that even in a volunteer force facing combat, soldiers can be coerced by military law, including ultimately death through desertion? What about rules of engagement? Well, I've written a lot about this. I encourage you to read my essays about rules of engagement, just war theory. I wrote a number of essays about this. They can be found online. But best is to get Ilan Journo's book, Winning the Unwinnable War, where I have 3 essays dealing with these issues. But military justice is moral. You sign a particular kind of contract when you volunteer in the military. Part of that contract involves accepting the military law. The military is a unique institution where they can, once you sign that contract, force you into combat. It's part of the contract. And you can be tried for desertion, and that is in the contract. So if you don't want to accept those terms, don't. I actually think military justice is immoral when it's a draft, when you don't choose it, when you have to accept their laws without choice. Then it's immoral. And then rules of engagement, of course, I think they should be, the principle should be reversed. The safety of your troops should be first and foremost, not sacrificed, and I talked about this earlier, not sacrificed for the well-being of the enemy or the enemy's civilian population. This says, the article criticizing Brad Thompson's book, also criticizes me, was the most thin-skinned piece of trash I've read in a while. All invectives, no argument. I agree, and if you followed him on Twitter afterwards, I actually fought back a little bit on Twitter against this guy. It turns out he's been like a pacifist conservative going back to the mid-2000s. He's been attacking me since then. He actually interviewed me once, or somebody interviewed me. Anyway, this guy is a real, he's familiar with objectivism, rejects objectivism, is one of these horrible kind of religious conservatives who carry their Christianity everywhere with them and think they're superior and smarter than anybody else because they can quote Cicero or something. And you see a lot of those. And I'm going to do more shows on the new right because there's a lot going on among conservatives right now. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I did stuff on BAP, BAP is Bronze Age pervert. He's gaining influence in the right. There's more and more articles by people influenced by him on the right. But then there's a whole new common good conservatism. There's another version of this, which is saying that those trying to interpret the Constitution based on originalist readings should abandon that. Conservatives doing that. And what conservatives need to do is adopt a common good interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution should be a living document, but it should be living based on the principles of the common good. And that's becoming hugely popular, not just among legal circles, conservatives, but also among other conservatives. So again, there's a lot to talk about in shows to come. One of my goals in this show is to be the leading voice critical of the new right, of the alt-right, new right, all variations of the right that are, I think, fundamentally anti-American. And when you read, there are going to be more critiques of Brad's book. You're going to see more of those. And it's going to be interesting because the fundamental premise of those critiquing Brad's book is that the biggest sin, the sins that Brad commits are, one, that he neglects the influence of religion on the Founding Fathers and the influence of religion on the nature of America, qua America. And second, that he emphasizes individualism too much, that the founding of America is not indeed about individualism, but about this notion of a common good, this notion of a nation and nationalism. So the attacks on Brad are going to be from a nationalist, common good Christian perspective. And so I'll have Brad on the show to talk about his article in this. And I think this is the battle of our life. This is the battle for the future of America. The left, to a large extent, the left is lost. And so there's a middle. But the middle is hard to win over when conservatives are wacky to the right and they pretend to be capitalist. So what we need to do is differentiate ourselves. Easy to differentiate ourselves from the wacky left. What we need to do is make clear the difference between us and the wacky right. And we need to really be, my view is, I think the risk of a takeover of our government, of authoritarianism in our government, will come from the right. I mean, the left will soften it up and the left will ultimately support it, but it will come from the right, and we need to fight them because that is the fight of the next few decades. It's going to be against this nationalist right. It's Leonard Peikoff's dim. The misintegration is not just around religion, it's about nationalism. And nationalism, I think, in America has to be mixed in with religion. But you're seeing the birth of that misintegration in front of our eyes. And if we don't fight that, then we're as good as dead. We're useless from a political, cultural perspective. So that's my job. All right, thanks. I saw some comments here about what is your answer. Oh, I've got a book on finance. The Mall Case of Finance. You can find that. I hope you can buy it on Amazon. Just look Yaron Brook, Finance. You'll get the book. All right, thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the show today. If you did, give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't, you can give it a thumbs down. That's fine. Just respond. More response is better. And then go... what should I say? Go to yaronbrookshow.com/support. You can support the show there financially. Didn't do a lot of Super Chat questions today, so, and then you can support the show on Locals, which is Dave Rubin's platform, and you can go and support the show on Patreon and on Subscribestar. So lots of places to engage, lots of places to support. I really appreciate those of you who support, particularly those who do monthly contributions, because then I know exactly what is coming. So thank you all for that. Don't forget to share the show. Don't forget to like the show. And I'll see you all sometime later this week. Maybe tomorrow, maybe Wednesday.